Hi, so welcome. My name is Savannah Cass. I'm a registered dietitian here at Align Modern Health. Today we're going to be talking about balancing flavors when cooking at home. So just a little bit about Align Modern Health. We are an integrative and functional medicine clinic. So what that means is that we take a look at the root cause of an issue instead of just focusing on the symptom. Some of our services include chiropractic care, clinical massage, acupuncture, functional medicine, as well as clinical nutrition. So just a little bit about myself. I am a registered dietitian. I graduated with a degree in culinary nutrition from Johnson & Wales. So that means I have an associate's degree in culinary arts. After I became personal chef for a few years, and then went on to become a registered dietitian. And after that, I went to India for about a year or so to study Ayurvedic medicine as well as Indian cuisine. And I'm also a Kundalini yoga instructor. So let's go right into our presentation. I'm going to start by defining taste. So taste is the sensation produced when a substance in the mouth chemically reacts with our taste bud receptors. We have around about 8,000 to 10,000 or so taste buds, around 5,000 on the front of our tongue. Most of our taste buds are located on the sides, front, and then back of the tongue. So not as much in the center. Each taste bud contains around 50 to 100 receptor cells, which can taste all of the 5 tastes. It just varies based on the taste bud. So for example, some taste buds are more sensitive to like the sweetness. Some taste buds are a little bit more sensitive to bitterness. The taste buds that are actually a little bit more sensitive to bitter are on the back of our tongue. And that's evolutionarily there because when we are tasting something bitter, a lot of the times it meant that it was poisonous. So if our taste buds are on the back of our tongue, whenever we did consume something that was bitter or potentially poisonous, we were able to spit it out and not swallow. Taste is very different from flavor. So that means that flavor incorporates the smell, the temperature, the texture of food, while taste is, we'll get into the 5 different tastes, but that is going to be different. So let's start with 5 different tastes. So the 5 tastes that we have are sweet, bitter, salty, sour, and umami. And we're going to go over them a bit more in depth. So let's start with sweet. The sweet taste is the most pleasurable to us because evolutionarily, when we tasted something sweet, that meant it was safe to eat. We have a few more natural sweet tasting foods, including your fruit, any like dried fruit as well, tends to enhance a little bit more sweetness. We also have our sweeter vegetables such as carrots, sweet potatoes, caramelized onions, which is the picture right in the center there, and that is just when the onions are cooked slow for a long period of time, it brings out the sweetness of the onion. There's also natural sugars and refined sugars, so stuff like maple syrup, honey, agave, molasses are more of the natural sweeteners, and then of course, table sugar is going to be more of the refined sweetener. So ideally, we would want to use more natural sweeteners and foods that are naturally sweet. So let's move on to our next taste, which is bitter. And bitter is the most sensitive of all the tastes. So not a lot of, there's some people that are really, enjoy bitter, but bitter is typically more sensitive to us. And it's perceived as something that's going to be like sharp. So that would be like really dark chocolate or unsweetened cocoa powder, coffee, very hoppy beer, olives. A lot of your green leafy vegetables are more bitter. So that would include kale, dandelion greens, chicory, Swiss chard. And then our next taste would be salty. Salty, so salt helps enhance flavors. So it enhances a lot of the other tastes. There are saltiness for like flavor enhancement, but also for preservation of food. So, for example, a lot of your processed foods have a lot of salt added to them, first to enhance the taste, but also to help preserve that food for longer. Which are more processed foods are going to be like frozen dinners, chips, pretzels, popcorn, stuff that we don't want to overindulge in. Some of our naturally salty foods would be like your seafood, shellfish, meats, especially more of the cured meats like salami, prosciutto, and then anything pickled. Typically it has added salt in the pickling liquid. So any of your pickled fruits or vegetables. So moving on to our next slide, would be sour. And sour is a little bit more of that like lip puckering taste. Sometimes this gets confused a little bit with bitter. It's actually the opposite of bitter. So think about, if you're biting into a lemon or a lime, that sensation, the lip puckering is more like that sourness. So we notice sour taste more in your lemons, limes, oranges, grapefruit, a lot of your citrus, vinegars, and then Greek yogurt, like an unsweetened Greek yogurt would be more sour. Sour does enhance salivation. So, for example, if you're more like a dry mouth, adding a little bit of lemon juice or lime juice to your water can help and enhance that salivation. So helps a little bit with the dry mouth. But you'll notice if you think about something that's very acidic or something that's very sour, you might start salivating. So moving on to our last taste, which is umami. And this is a bit newer of a taste. So more recently kind of discovered. But umami is actually a Japanese term. And it's considered more of like the earthy, savory, meaty type taste. So we get those from mushrooms, truffles, tomato paste, harder cheeses like Parmesan cheese, soy sauce. So those are some of the umami. It's a little bit harder to describe, but it's going to be that very earthy, savory, helps kind of round out a dish, kind of gives it a little bit of depth. So moving on, our next slide, we're going to just talk a bit about flavor and what flavor is and how it's different from your taste. So on this wheel here, we see that our tastes are going to be the umami, sweet, bitter, salty, and sour. The ones that are different are our texture and our temperature, and then spicy. So texture is really about the mouthfeel of the food or of the dish. So is it crunchy? Is it smooth? Is it silky? Is it lumpy? Because that really can go into how you perceive and how you feel about the dish. Same thing goes with temperature. Is it very cold? Is it room temperature? Is it hot? Temperature can also change the a different taste, which we'll talk about, but it'll change the flavor. So you might not like something cold, but you might like it a lot better heated. So those are some things to think about whenever you're putting together a meal, because it all has to come in combination to your liking to make sure that you agree with the flavor of the dish. So moving on, we're going to be talking about flavor and how to build, correct, and balance different flavors whenever you're cooking a meal. So first, we're going to, there's just a few flavor combinations for you. For, you know, if you're making any type of protein or vegetable, or a dish where you're not really using a recipe, you can use this as somewhat of like a beginner guide. Another resource that might be helpful is a book called The Flavor Bible, which has a list of foods, and then there are different ingredients like herbs and spices and other foods that go best with that food. So for example, it would have a list of, you know, say the carrots, and it would list everything that goes well with the taste of carrots. So that can also be helpful in pairing together specific taste. So our next slide is going to be discussing some of the herbs, different spices, vinegars, citrus that we can add in order to enhance the flavor, especially if something, you know, is a little bit too bland, or you want to impart a bit more flavor and taste into a dish. Especially if you've already like salted and peppered it, but you feel like it needs a little bit more. Here is a nice variety of different herbs, different spices. The vinegars and citrus can help bring a little bit more brightness to a dish. So doing like having a splash of red wine vinegar, apple cider vinegar, a little squeeze of lemon juice or lime juice can really help bring that brightness to a dish. If you feel like something might be missing, umami is another taste that you can add to help add a little bit more roundness to the dish as well. So if you feel like something's missing, it could be the umami. And moving on, we're going to talk about sweetness. So if you're making something that is supposed to be sweeter, if it tends to be a little bit too sweet, so for example, if you're making a cake and you've accidentally made it too sweet, you can add some type of sourness to it. So that would be like maybe adding a little bit of lemon zest to the cake or orange zest. You can also add a healthier fat or just a fat in general. So you could add like cream cheese to that, will kind of help cut the sweetness of the cake. Or you can even add something a little bit more bitter, like unsweetened cacao powder. And that can also cut the sweetness a bit. And that's fairly common if you see like some desserts or have that like citrus zest or the cocoa powder. You can also try to dilute it depending on what you're making with a little bit more liquid. If it's not sweet enough, I would try not to go straight to table sugar first, but there's a few different things that you're able to add that will bring some natural sweetness. So that can be agave, honey, maple syrup, molasses, or if you want to try more of like a food that you can add, could be berries, tomatoes, carrots, or even some nut butters like peanut butter, sunflower seed butter can add a little sweetness as well. Um, so an example of this is tomato sauce. Tomato sauce is typically you add some table sugar because it needs a little bit of balancing with the acidity of this. But instead of adding sugar to your tomato sauce, you can maybe add some caramelized onions, and that would be adding a natural sweetness, but you're also adding some onions as well. So moving on to the next taste, we have bitter, and bitter is very cooling. It can also help stimulate the appetite. So if you're having a bit lower of an appetite, eating something that's going to be a little bit more bitter can help with that. It also brings a little bit of lightness to a dish, can help balance your sweetness and cut through some of the richness. It's a little harsh for a lot of people to have too much bitter. You don't want your dish to be like only bitter. So kind of use it a little bit more as a background flavor instead of just a whole, dish completely bitter. But if you feel like you need to add a little bitterness to something, you can add like some type of green to more like a cheesy dish, and that would, the cheesy dishes are typically pretty rich. Adding some of the green can help kind of cut that richness. Or again, if you're using like unsweetened cocoa powder as something bitter to cut the richness of like a flourless chocolate cake, or some type of like truffle that's pretty rich, can be an option. If you're making a dish and it's a little too bitter, then I would recommend adding a sour component. So that could be like your vinegar or your citrus. Could be something sweet or a warmer spice. Like cinnamon or nutmeg can also give the perception that it's sweet, even though you're not adding anything, any like sugar or anything. An example of this would be like if you're making collard greens. A pretty common thing when you're making collard greens is adding some little splash of apple cider vinegar. Since the greens are bitter, apple cider vinegar can help curb that bitterness a bit. Or it could be like a squeeze of lemon juice after the greens are done. Interesting fact is that the warmer something is, the less bitter it will taste. So for example, you're trying to add in like dandelion greens, which are super bitter, very highly nutritious, but very bitter. Cooking it, like sauteing it, will kind of help dampen the bitterness a bit. And you can add in a lot of, you can add in like a splash of vinegar to it, or you can add in some caramelized onions, maybe adding a little bit of corn, as something sweet and something sour to balance that bitter along with cooking it. So that's going to be a lot more tolerable of a way instead of just having a dandelion green salad, which might be a little hard to get down. So moving on to our next taste, we have salty. So salty is a little bit of a challenge depending on what you're making to take back. So I would definitely try to taste as you cook to make sure that you're still adding some of the salt or something salty without going overboard. If something is too salty though, there's a few things that you can try doing. And if it's a soup or a stew, I would say diluting it. It's probably going to be a good option. I dilute it with more water there because typically if you're like buying a stock or if you're using stock, it's already pretty salty. So unless you make your own and you don't add salt to it, I would try diluting it with some water. And then you can also add just other ingredients to the soup to make a bigger batch. Adding potatoes can also help, or like root vegetable, can also help absorb some of the salt. So that can be another option. Or adding a little like vinegar, citrus, or something acidic can also help with that. If it's not salty enough, obviously you have your like sea salts that you can add, just tasting as you go. Other options to just our sea salt would be soy sauce, seaweed, olives, capers. So that can be another way of adding your saltiness without adding salt. And it's something to keep in mind, because if you already added a lot of salt to a dish, or if you're already content with the saltiness of a dish and you add soy sauce on top of it, or olives or capers on top of it, then it might get the point of too salty. So I would think of that as your salt factor. And a way to add those things in could be like capers on salmon. If you're having like crushed olives, you can add that to like roasted cauliflower. Those are a few options there. So our next taste is going to be sour. And sour, as I mentioned before, kind of brings a little bit of brightness to a dish. It helps balance your sweetness, and then it can also cut the bitterness. So like with the collard greens and apple cider vinegar. It can also help kind of sharpen some of the flavors. So it might sound strange when I say like brings a little bit of brightness to a dish, but I think when you experiment with this a little bit more, you kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about. For example, let's take like a 3-bean salad. Beans are kind of a little bland by themselves. So if you're experimenting with more of the beans lentils, I would try adding some herbs, some spices, but also like squeeze of lemon juice, squeeze of lime juice in a 3-bean salad can really brighten it up. So you can kind of experiment with that. Something to be mindful of is there are sour, naturally sour things, and there are things that have gone sour. So like if you have milk or juice that is gone bad, then definitely that should be avoided. But there are things that are naturally sour, like kefir, that just be mindful of the expiration date. If some things are too sour, then you can add a little bit of sweetness to it, or you can try introducing some type of umami. So an example of that would be, say if you're making a stir fry, you're adding some rice vinegar and you add a little bit too much. So it's a little sour or a little more too acidic. Then you can add a splash of soy sauce, and that can help round out that flavor a bit, cut some of the sourness. Or you can try adding some mushrooms, and that can bring a little bit more umami and help with the sourness. Another option could be like if you're making a yogurt or kefir based sauce or dressing, adding a little bit of honey to it can kind of dampen the sourness a bit more by adding that sweet component. So moving on to our next slide, we talk about the umami. So as I mentioned, umami is that very earthy taste. So a way that we can add some umami-rich foods would be adding like tomato paste, or maybe adding some miso. Miso is a little bit of umami and salty, so I would consider that, it is saltier. But that can be an option to like your soups, sauces, dressings, stews, anything like that you can add. Or sometimes like in soup recipes, you might see either tomato paste or like a Parmesan rind, just to impart some of that umami flavor. You can also add a splash of Worcestershire sauce to again, any of like your soups or sauces, or say if you're making like a marinade, if you're marinating meat or anything like that, that can be an option to add a little bit more of that earthy taste to it. There's also shiitake like mushroom powders or mushroom salts, and that can be added to your meat, seafood, or vegetable dishes. So, and we could try experimenting with some of the mushroom salts first, but there's also some mushroom powders that could be an option, as well as mushroom stocks, which will help enhance the flavor, say if you're making like quinoa, but also give it a little bit more of that umami if you're cooking something in a mushroom stock. Going off, continuing with the mushroom trend, if you're mincing mushrooms and you saute them, it has a similar mouth feel. So going back to the flavor, your texture has a similar mouth feel to ground meat. So to add a little bit more vegetable without necessarily having like a side of vegetable can be adding some of your sauteed minced mushrooms to like pasta sauce with some of your ground meat as well as mushrooms. Or if you're making a burger, you can add in some sauteed minced mushrooms to that as well. And that can help bring a little bit more umami to the dish. So moving on, spicy. So spicy is not actually a taste. It's kind of, it's heat and then it's pain. So it's heat and pain, but it's not really part of the five taste. So a little bit of spice, can go a long way. This is the same with salt. I would kind of taste as you go, make sure that, it works for you. But some some spicy foods that you can add would be your chili powder, jalapeno, cayenne powder, red pepper paste can also be an option. If you accidentally put a little bit too much spice into a meal, then you can use something sweet to help balance that out. Or I like using some cooling ingredients like coconut milk, mayonnaise, sour cream, yogurt, can be ways to kind of dull down that heat. And that is a pretty cultural thing as well. So like in India, they use yogurt as that cooling effect next to a dish if it's a bit too spicy. In Mexico, it's a sour cream that they add to help, dampen the spiciness or to tolerate it a bit better. So yeah, I'm gonna experiment with some of those more cooling ingredients. So moving on, just a few final thoughts. Just a few more ways to impart some flavor and experiment with this. So when you're sauteing or when you're searing something, you might notice that there's a little bit of like brown stuff at the bottom of the pan, and we call that fond. So fond is flavor. It should be utilized in your meal, in your recipe. So in order to get some of that flavor off of the bottom of the pan, we deglaze the pan. And deglazing the pan means that you're adding maybe a little splash of vinegar, some white wine, some red wine, maybe it's some stock, broth, tomato sauce. So anything that can help lift that flavor off of the bottom of the pan, and then incorporate that into your dish for added flavor. I would, try experimenting with some like unfamiliar herbs and spices, maybe finding recipes at first that showcases some of these new herbs and spices to you. And once you get a little bit more familiar with their taste, then you can try using them outside of a recipe, but you can try using them to flavor, your meat, fish, or grain vegetable dishes. And once you get familiar with the blends as well and what you like, and you can slowly start moving away from recipes. Or say if you do have a recipe that you've used and it doesn't taste good, then you can use this to really decipher what it is that it might be lacking, and then trying to add some of those taste to the recipe and experiment with it and to find the flavor that works best for you that you like. Another way to try to utilize some of these recommendations would be experimenting with different types of cuisines, because each cuisine has like different flavor combinations. So introducing recipes from different types of cuisines can be a way of exploring different flavors you might not be used to. So that is all for us. Thank you so much for joining. We'll take some questions, so feel free to type them into the Q&A. If you are interested in a consultation or a free 15-minute consultation, you can feel free to call or visit our website, and we'll give it a little bit more time to add some questions into the Q&A. Let me go here. Check that out. Okay. So we have one question. What are the best ways to experiment with various herbs like cilantro, basil, and fennel? So I would say cilantro is a nice herb if you're making any type of Asian or Mexican cuisine. So maybe trying some recipes that goes into your Thai Mexican. So I like using cilantro in mixed in with my either beans or lentils. Adding some cumin and jalapeno can be helpful with that. Basil is a pretty easy one to add in. You can try making pesto with basil. That's a nice way to include, or any type of Italian dishes. Adding it to pasta is an easy way. Or if you're making anything with tomatoes, cucumbers, olives, and then basil, it's a good combo as well. And fennel, that's more of a licorice taste. So depending on if you like licorice, I think adding fennel, you typically use the bulb, but you can also use the green stuff, more of the herb as well. And yeah, that can be added to some meat dishes or vegetables. And then there's some recipes out there with just the fennel bulb, which are good sauteed. And you could just try that, by itself. Okay, can you suggest best spices for interesting smoothies? So for smoothies, you can try ginger, turmeric. Those are very anti-inflammatory spices as well. I sometimes recommend a golden milk smoothie. So that could be adding some carrots as well as turmeric to it. Cardamom is another option as a spice add to a smoothie that kind of gets into the chai flavors. So you might experiment with more of a chai smoothie base. And some people also add herbs to smoothies, parsley, which can be an option as well. did I say that milk helps to cut salt in dishes that might be too salty? You can try depending on what it is. You can try adding some milk. I said like diluting it, so adding water, but not stock, because stock is typically already salty. But yeah, if you're diluting something, you can try milk. When is it good to cook with fresh herbs and when to cook with dried herbs? I think sometimes dried herbs are stronger. You're right, dried herbs are stronger. So if you see a recipe, you're going to be using a lot more fresh herbs compared to dried herbs. So if you're subbing dried herbs, don't use as much as they say. You can kind of put in, a little bit and see how it tastes. But yeah, dried herbs are stronger. Whenever you're making, like, I guess I'm thinking of mostly like a soup or something like that. Dried herbs you can use in the beginning, and your spices you can use in the beginning. It actually helps. Let's take, for example, turmeric. It actually helps build the flavor through the dish if you add the herbs and spices, dried herbs and spices in the beginning of the cooking process. But I would save your fresh herbs towards the end, because if you add them in the beginning, then that can, severely wilt them and they lose some of their flavor. So if I'm adding fresh cilantro, fresh parsley, fresh basil, I would add it towards the end of the cooking process, not the beginning. The dried herbs I would add towards the beginning. And I think that's it. If anyone else has any more questions. Yeah, looks like that's it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, thank you for everything. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.